Eleanor hadn't heard the sound of laughter in her home for nearly 20 years. The house had settled into a quiet rhythm, wood floors that creaked with memory, wind that slipped through the cracks like whispers from the past, and the constant tick of the old kitchen clock. She didn't mind the silence anymore. It was familiar, predictable, like grief itself. Her days were simple. She rose before dawn, boiled water for tea, and sat by the window as the sky turned soft with morning light. The only photograph on her mantelpiece, framed in worn silver, was of her infant son. He had passed in his sleep before he ever learned to speak. His smile was still there, frozen in time. She lit a candle for him every evening. Not out of ritual, but out of love, the kind of love that never fades, even when the person is gone. That morning, the wind was sharp. Autumn had rolled in overnight, brushing the hills in copper and gold. Eleanor wrapped her shawl tight, stepped into her worn boots, and headed out with a wicker basket to collect twigs and kindling from the field beyond the fence. The field stretched wide and quiet, a sea of dry grass rustling under the breeze. But then she paused. There it was, a sound so soft she nearly missed it. Faint, high-pitched, not quite a bleat, not quite a cry. Eleanor turned her head, eyes narrowing. The sound came again, urgent, fragile. Her heartbeat picked up. Her boots moved through the brush with purpose, crunching dry leaves beneath each step. Closer now, just beyond the old oak tree. She stopped. In the hollow under a tangle of weeds and thorns, she saw it. A tiny goat, newborn, weak, shaking with every breath. Its coat was white as milk, stained with dirt and dew. It looked up at her with wide, wet eyes. Eleanor stared. There was a mark on its leg, a dark patch, round and small, exactly like the birthmark her son had on his wrist. Her breath caught. Her knees buckled slightly as she crouched down, slowly, gently. She reached out, hands trembling, afraid to scare it off. But the little goat didn't move. It just looked at her, as if it recognized her, as if it had been waiting. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Eleanor whispered into the wind, "Is it you?" Something inside her shifted. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like the beginning of something she hadn't dared to believe in. A return. Eleanor stood still, staring at the fragile little creature nestled in the grass. Its tiny body shook with every breath, legs folded awkwardly beneath it, barely able to lift its head. The morning air was crisp, but the chill that passed through Eleanor had nothing to do with the wind. She took a slow step forward, the dry grass brushing against her skirt. Her eyes locked on the strange mark on the baby goat's leg, a dark, almost circular patch, small and unmistakable. It couldn't be. She dropped to her knees without thinking, her old joints protesting against the cold earth. She reached out, hesitantly at first, her fingers hovering just above the goat's side. When her hand finally made contact, the animal didn't flinch. It simply leaned into her touch, softly, slowly, as though it had been waiting for her. Her breath hitched in her throat. That mark, that exact shape, it was the same one her son had been born with, just above his wrist. She had kissed it every night, told him it was his little moon. The goat blinked slowly, its eyes deep and still. Eleanor wrapped it in her shawl and held it close to her chest, barely noticing how cold her hands had become. She told herself she was only bringing it home so it wouldn't die out here, not out of sentiment. But even as she stepped through the front door and laid it by the hearth, she felt something shift inside her, something she hadn't allowed in years. She fed it warm milk from a dropper, tucked it in with an old flannel, and sat beside it, humming under her breath, an old lullaby, the same one she used to sing when rocking her son to sleep. As the melody filled the room, the goat's breathing slowed. Its eyes fluttered shut, and when she stopped, it stirred, letting out the faintest cry. She began to hum again, and it settled instantly, curling into a ball. Its tiny limbs tucked the same way her baby had always slept. Her heart pounded louder than the wind against the window panes. She watched, frozen, as it nuzzled against the blanket, the way her child had once nestled into her chest. No, it wasn't possible. It couldn't be. And yet, something inside her whispered otherwise. This wasn't just a goat. This was something else. Something more. A presence. A return. She sat back in her chair, staring at the firelight dancing on the walls, the baby goat asleep beside her. Her hand covered her mouth, trembling. Could it be him? The question hung in the silence like breath in winter air, unanswered but alive. She named him Little One, not because she meant to, but because the name slipped from her lips one morning, unthinking, like an old habit waking from sleep. It had been the pet name she used for her son, whispered countless times into soft baby skin, now spoken aloud again after decades of silence. And somehow when she said it, the goat responded. His ears twitched. He turned his head toward her as if he'd been waiting to hear it. That was the first sign. The second came during feeding. Eleanor poured warm milk into a shallow bowl and nudged it toward him, but he didn't move, just stared. She tried again. Nothing. Then on instinct, she tapped the edge of the bowl. Once, twice, 3 times. Just like she used to do to coax her son to eat, back when he was still too young to understand words but old enough to recognize rhythm. Little One's ears perked. He stepped forward and began to drink. Her hands trembled. Each evening, as shadows crept across the walls and the house filled with that familiar hush, Little One would wander into the living room. Without fail, he would stop in front of the mantel where the candle flickered next to her baby's photograph, and he would just look. Not glance, but gaze. Eyes locked onto the image. Some nights he even nudged it gently with his nose, as if reaching for a memory only he could feel. Eleanor sat in the rocker, watching, breath caught in her throat. She never spoke. She didn't want to break the spell. Then, one night, just as the wind howled against the glass and the fire had died low, she heard a sound from the corner of the room. A soft cry. Not the bleat of a goat. Something else. Higher, thinner. It sliced through the air like a thread of sound from another world. A sound that stopped her heart, because she had heard it before, late at night, long ago, when her son would whimper in his sleep and reach for her in the dark. She rose slowly, her knees stiff, and knelt beside Little One. He looked up at her, eyes wide and still, as if he knew exactly what she'd heard. The next day she told her neighbor, Ruth, about it. Ruth smiled kindly but said maybe she'd been dreaming, or maybe loneliness was playing tricks on her. Eleanor only nodded. She didn't argue. How could she explain what she knew, what she felt? It wasn't madness. It was recognition. Her grief no longer hung over her like a storm. It had softened into something else, something gentler. She could feel in her chest, a quiet warmth she hadn't known in years. Wonder, maybe. Or grace, a tiny light flickering back to life. The days began to change, slowly at first, like morning light creeping in through a half-closed curtain. Eleanor found herself speaking aloud again, not just to Little One, but to the wind, the flowers, the sky. Her voice, unused for so long, returned with a softness that surprised even her. She started planting daffodils along the edge of the garden, just like she used to when her son was small. She fed the birds, humming as she scattered seeds, and sometimes, on the quietest afternoons, she laughed. Not loudly, not carelessly, but the kind of laughter that bubbles up gently, like water returning to a dry well. Little One followed her everywhere. He waited by the porch in the mornings, dozed under her chair in the afternoons. When she worked in the garden, he lay in the dirt beside her, eyes half closed, ears twitching as if listening to her stories, stories she hadn't told in years. There was a peace between them that needed no words, only presence. Then came the day everything stopped. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning to fall behind the trees, and Eleanor was out back trimming some old rosemary bushes. She stood too fast, reached the wrong way, and her foot caught on a loose stone. A sharp pain tore through her ankle as she crumpled to the ground. The basket of herbs spilled beside her. She tried to sit up, but couldn't. Her ankle throbbed violently. She was alone. The road was far, and her voice, hoarse with panic, barely carried. Little One stood frozen, ears pinned, eyes locked on her. Then he ran, straight through the open garden gate, his tiny hooves pounding the gravel. Eleanor's heart raced, not from fear of being left, but from the impossible hope that maybe, just maybe, he understood. Somewhere down the trail, a young hiker named Caleb was walking his dog when he heard it, a sharp, urgent bleating coming from the woods. He followed the sound, pushing through the brush, and found Little One circling at the edge of Eleanor's garden, calling, calling. Minutes later, Eleanor heard voices, footsteps, and then relief. She was carried inside, ankle-bound, warm tea in hand. The pain still lingered, but her eyes were wet with something deeper. She cradled Little One in her lap, holding him the way she once held her son, close, tender, Full of thanks, she pressed her forehead to his and whispered through the tears, "You came back to save me, didn't you, baby?" And in that moment, she no longer questioned the impossible. She simply believed. The seasons turned quietly, as they always had. Spring gave way to summer, then drifted into the gentle hush of fall again. Eleanor no longer marked the passage of time with sorrow. Each day with little one had become a gift, measured not in months, but in moments. She had stopped asking questions, stopped searching for explanations. What mattered was the feeling, the warmth, the presence, the peace that had returned to her after so many years of silence. But nothing, not even love like that, lasts forever. She had noticed him slowing down. He slept more, followed her a little less. His breaths came shallower, his steps lighter. He still looked at her the same way, though, as if he knew something she didn't, as if he had always known. It was a quiet morning. The sky was overcast, the light soft and gray. Eleanor sat in her favorite chair by the fire, knitting something small, a habit she'd taken up again without really knowing why. Little one wandered over and without a sound, rested his head gently on her lap. She looked down, her hand instinctively reaching to stroke the soft fur between his ears. He didn't move. There was no struggle, no sound, just stillness, a final breath long and slow, and then still. Eleanor didn't cry. She sat there for a long time, holding him close, one hand resting over his heart. A soft smile touched her lips, not of joy, but of knowing. She leaned down and whispered, as if into a dream, "You did what you came to do, my love. Thank you." In the days that followed, the house didn't feel empty. Not anymore. The silence had changed. It wasn't hollow. It was full, full of memory, of meaning, of something eternal. And then, quietly, she began again. She cleared a space in her backyard, built a small shed, and put out a sign. Hand-painted crooked letters that read, "Little One's Place." It wasn't much, but it was enough. A sanctuary for abandoned or orphaned animals, those who had been lost, just like he once was. She welcomed them one by one with soft hands and open arms, and gave them the same thing she had once been given, a second chance, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of grace. Because sometimes souls find their way back, not in the form we expect, but always in the way we need. So maybe this story isn't just about a woman and a little goat. Maybe it's about how love endures, even through grief, even through time, even across the boundaries we don't fully understand. Eleanor's journey reminds us that healing can come in the most unexpected forms, that no act of kindness is ever wasted, that when we open our hearts, even just a little, something beautiful finds its way in. Little One came into her life not just to be saved, but to save her. And now, through the sanctuary she built in his name, that love continues. It multiplies. It reaches others who are lost, frightened, forgotten, just like he once was. So if you're listening now, take this with you. Open your eyes to the small lives around you, the stray in the alley, the injured bird, the animal left behind. Sometimes saving them is how we save ourselves. And if you ever wonder whether your love matters, just remember Eleanor, and a little goat who came back, not as a miracle to be explained, but as a soul to be held. Support your local shelters, rescue if you can. Love whenever you're able, because love always finds its way back, and it always leaves something behind.